Alright, welcome to this video on introductory spreadsheets. The skills and items that we're going to be covering will be focusing on this particular unit standard, which is a level 2 standard on how to use the main features and functions of a spreadsheet. It's a pretty nice standard actually. There's no planning requirements for it. It's simply do a bunch of skills that's outlined to you through a brief or a plan, and then do some charts, etc., and meet some of the criteria. So some of the things that you'll be expected to be able to do is to be able to work with data that's in columns, be able to try and make things look attractive by improving the formatting of a file, putting headers and formats, etc., on things, converting numbers to percentages and increasing or decreasing decimal points, and structuring it in such a way that the data that's presented then turns into information by putting labels, etc., and titles onto your spreadsheet. Talks about things in the standard such as using good practice such as alignment, adding labels, doing calculations, etc., to solve problems, using shortcuts required, using display options for how things look on the screen, being able to effectively navigate between worksheets, and if you get stuck, learning about some of the tools in terms of what you can use to help you, such as some of the online help functions. Being able to share the file, we'll simply do that by handing in work into our teacher Dropbox by the end of the assessment, and also saving things with logical file names so that you can find things quickly when you're wanting to work on things at a later time. So from time to time you'll come across a few little errors. We've got 3 here that have been identified, and it's knowing that with these errors you can try and work them through to solve some of the most common issues that you might come across. When we get down to the bulk of the standard, some of the things that are needed are the use of shortcut keys, being able to go through and enter data effectively. Being accurate with these entries as well is fairly important, so that anything that we do with that data still remains relevant. We also need to do a couple of charts or graphs with the information, and then being able to know how we can change width and height of columns and rows, etc., would be useful. Coming on down to the bottom here, we're wanting to do some of these basic functions. So a lot of these are straightforward maths functions, and spreadsheet programs have got the ability to do this in a quick and easy manner. That's easier than the likes of doing it with some of your maths techniques that you've been taught. So without further ado, we're going to go through and look at some sample data that are found on the web. I'm simply going to be copying and pasting this information across. It's quite a long data set, so I'll just do about half of it so you can kind of see the techniques that I might want to be trying to demonstrate through this video. We're going to be focusing on Microsoft Excel, which is a pretty commonly used business application, but just be aware that a lot of the skills that I do cover can be easily applied to the likes of Google Sheets and other online or offline applications. So if I was to copy and paste this information into a Google Sheet, for instance, you'll notice the information comes across nice and formatted. There's an option here to be able to strip out some of that formatting or just retain the formatting without the actual data. So it kind of depends on what you're after when you're wanting to bring things across. If I want to strip that out, by keeping the values only, it removes any of the colors, etc., but also some of the number formattings have been removed, and you can simply go through and reapply as required. As I say though, we're going to be using Microsoft Excel, so here we are on this particular worksheet. At the moment I've removed all the other worksheets and I've just got one page. Now this particular page here is got a series of these little rectangles. These rectangles are called a cell, and a cell is denoted by a cell address. In this case, this cell is called C2, and that is because this letter across the top here, when I click it, you'll notice that we've got the down arrow, will go all the way down to the bottom of this particular item, which is called a column. Over here, we've got something called a row. When I click on the number over the side, it will highlight this entire row. If I was to push the control down button, it will pop down to the very bottom of this particular column. If I was to push the control right button, it will go across to the far right hand side. So you can see for this particular worksheet that I've got, it's very wide and it's very tall. So it can hold incredible amounts of information on a single page. And then when we've filled this particular page up, we can add another worksheet and another one. And when all of these are combined, we form a workbook or a single Microsoft Excel file. So generally what we do is we try to have related items within a single worksheet rather than having 50 odd unrelated items together in a single work file. So when we're trying to deal with Excel, we want to try and deal with these cell addresses or references all the time. And the reason for that is that when we want to do calculations, we will use the address rather than the actual value of what's located inside the cell. Therefore, if the actual contents of the cell changes, our answers down the bottom will also tally up. Let me give you an example. So I'm going to plug in several numbers here, and I'm going to do that by clicking on the cell, typing a number, and I like to use the numeric keypad over the right hand side of your keyboard. If it does weird things, whereby when you're clicking on the keys, that's moving up and down like a cursor, it may be that you need to push the numlock key, which is over by the numeric keypad on the right hand side. Okay, so when we push the numbers in here, push the little enter button that's in the numeric keypad, and it will drop down by one cell. If you type in additional numbers and push, say, the down arrow, it will navigate down. If I was to push the right arrow, it would navigate to the right hand side. If I go through and push the tab key, it will also jump to the right hand side. If I was to type in another number, push the up arrow, it would fill the entry in and then go to the cell above it. So you may notice that when I've got those different cells, or those numbers in those cells now, and I put my mouse over the top of it, it's got this giant big plus symbol on it. This is my general selection tool. If I left click and drag down, what I've done is I've just made a selection. I've highlighted a range or a selection of cells. If I was to go through, select one of those cells, and then come to the bottom of that, you'll notice that the cursor changes to these four arrows. If I left click and drag that now, what that is doing is moving the contents of the cell from one location to another. This is the same thing as a copy and paste. If I was to go through and do that same procedure on a bunch of cells, I can quickly and easily move large numbers of cells from one place to another. If I was to go through and do that same process pushing the control button, what that will do is do a copy and paste. So that can be quite a useful skill for when you wanted to move things around quickly. It's also important that you know some of the commonly used shortcut keys for the standard, and also so that to help improve our workflow. Over the side here I've got some of the most commonly used ones that we'll use in lots of different applications, not just Excel or other Microsoft products, but also the likes of Google Sheets and others. So Control C, Control X and Control V to copy, cut and paste. When you're wanting to select the entire worksheet, Control A will highlight everything on my page. If I do that within the likes of some data, it is just selecting the ranges of cells that are located to it with a selection. Control P will go through and print off the information. Control N will start a new Excel file. Control Z is when we make a mistake. So for instance, if we delete something off, Control plus Z will undo that mistake. To redo that mistake, Control Y. When you have formulas that you'd like to display on the screen, there's a button there called Control tilde. That is the button that's underneath the escape key up the top left hand corner. F4 is something that we'll get into a little bit later on. Alright, so now that we've got these values over the side here, I want to show you some of the things that we can do. I'm just going to drop down the bottom here, and we're going to go through and use this like an incredibly powerful calculator. Excel has got so many built-in functions that we could look at covering, but we just need to cover some of the most basic ones for us. So now whenever we want to try and do a calculation, we always start with the equal symbol. This tells the program to expect us to do a calculation. Now, if this was a regular calculator, we could go through and just plug in our values, push the enter button. We'd end up with the correct answer, but the problem is with doing this method, if these values across the top here were to change, our answer down the bottom does not reflect that. So what we try and do instead is, rather than using actual values, we will click on the cell that contains the number instead. You'll notice that when I've selected the cell, we've got these little moving lines which indicates that the cell has been selected. We call those the marching ants. Up the top here we have something called the address bar. That allows us to continue the calculation or the formula on, or you'll notice down the bottom we've got our cursor ready to do the same thing. So what we can go through and do here is we can go through and select each cell, tapping the plus button in between. what that is now doing is showing all the cells that we would like to add. You'll notice that it color codes each of these cells as well. When I push the Enter key, it will perform the calculation. Using that example I gave before, if I was to suddenly change the contents of this cell now, look at how the cell down the bottom with my answer, when I push Enter, is automatically updated. So this shows the value of using a spreadsheet versus a calculator. Now, one of the problems that we may have when we're dealing with large numbers of large amounts of data is this is going to be quite a long process. So instead, what we will use is something called a function. Now, a function is a built-in bit of code that the program knows how to deal with. So another word for addition is to sum something. So the way that we're going to do this is we will type in the function sum. As soon as you start typing in the letter S, you'll see a whole bunch of these functions that are pre-made and built in. As I mentioned, there are lots of them available, and we only need to know a few of them. So you can simply double click on it and it will start the actual telling the cells that we'd like to include within this range by using an opening bracket or parentheses. All I need to do here is drag down, indicate that I would like to add up all of these numbers here, and then complete the function by doing an end bracket. When I push Enter, you'll see now that we've got our calculation working out the total. Now, same story as before, if I was to suddenly change some of the values within that range, my answer down the bottom is being updated. So this is called the sum function, and we use this for when we want to do addition. There are other calculations that we can do as well. So for instance, if we're wanting to try and go through and do some others, let's think about some of the other commonly used things that you've learned in maths. Okay, so after addition, we might want to learn how we can do subtraction. So using the subtraction key, we could take away the smaller number from the larger number to end up with a positive number. We can also try and work with negative numbers as well, depending on the order in which we perform the operations. Next thing we might choose to try and do is potentially some multiplication. With the multiplication symbol, we will use the asterisk sign, which is also on the right hand side of our numeric keypad or up on the top of the keyboard by pushing Shift and the number 8. Okay, so we're multiplying those two cells together to end up with 700 in this case. The last of our main calculations that you would have learnt when you go to primary school is division. Now, the division symbol is the forward slash that you can see here. So 10 divided by 2 will end up with 5. Now, down towards the bottom here, when you've got a big range of numbers, sometimes it would take a long time to go through and do those calculations. What I'm going to do now is, using that copied information that I did previously, I'm now going to paste my values onto the page. Okay, so here is my values that I've copied and pasted from the internet. There's a few things here that we'd like to do before we go any further. Down the bottom, when you copy and paste information, there are several options for how you choose to try and keep this data when you move it across. I can choose to keep the source formatting, which is all the blue side of things, or I can match the destination styles. Destination styles has removed the formatting that you can see, so you may choose to keep the original formatting or remove it. Remember that formatting is the looks and appearance of information. So for instance, this blue background and this dark bolded writing is going to be considered formatting, as well as the borders around the outside. We sometimes do this to make our labels across the top here stand out from the actual values underneath. If you don't want that to apply yourself, simply go through and remove. Other things that you may notice when you see this copied information is that we've got a bunch of these pound symbols or hashtags. This is indicating that the size of the data does not quite manage to fit into this small cell. So some of the things that we often want to do is to resize the width of our columns. We can do that by clicking on the column or coming up towards the top here and noticing that when I go between A and B, my cursor changes to this symbol here. If I left click and drag, I can increase the width of my particular column. You'll notice now all those hashtags have gone away. Another way of doing the same thing is to simply double click and it will resize the columns to fit things nicely. So come in between the C and the D in this case, double click and it will resize so that all of the information is able to be presented. You can do this quickly as well by selecting multiple columns or rows, double clicking, and the same thing will occur. Same thing can be done for the likes of some rows as well. If you'd like to spread things out a little bit more, by highlighting multiple rows and then increasing the height of the row, you'll notice that all of the rows have increased in height and not just the bottom one. If I'm wanting to do it to a single row or a single column, you can do that also. So now that we've got this information here being stripped of its formatting and having everything fitting nicely, there are some basic formatting techniques which would be useful to know. So the first thing that I want to try and do is apply some of that background color. So using the fill color, I can go up the top here and try and use some nice formatting. Be careful about using these colors down the bottom and these ones here as well. They're often too vibrant and can be difficult to read on the screen or in printouts. So I tend to stick to these first few rows of colors. Other things that you might choose to do to make things stand out so that they are clearly seen is the likes of some bolding and some italics for our writing. I tend to stay away from underlining. There are other techniques which are perhaps better, such as the use of different fonts, etc. Another thing that all spreadsheets should have would be a descriptive title. One of the ways that you can do that is by selecting on the row, right-clicking on it, and then going down to the Insert menu to insert a new row. The same thing can be applied to the likes of columns. You can right-click on it, click Insert, and things will shift back. If you've made a mistake by doing that, simply click on the column, right-click, click Delete. Everything will shift back. Do the same thing for the row, push Delete, everything will shift up. If I was to try and undo that command, Control Z, we're going to try and now put a title across the top here. You'll notice that when I select, each of these are considered a separate cell. After highlighting all of those cells, I'm now going to do something called a merge and center. What this will do is we'll combine all of this, those cells that I've selected and treat it now as one single cell. So I'm going to go through here and type in sales information and apply a major title to this. Because I'd like this to stand out, I'm going to use a slightly different shade of green, and maybe I'll change the color of my font to be a light color, make it a bit larger, maybe do some bolding, italics, etc. So we've now got some of this information here to stand out by having a title to describe what we're looking at and some labels underneath as well. One of the things that I've noticed here with the likes of my first column is that we've got different alignments for my text. When you're trying to standardize things, it can be quite useful to come in here and apply one of these over everything. Other things that you can do is you can change the vertical alignment inside cells as well if required. Next, what we're trying to do here is talk about numbers. So obviously you can see here we've got a number of units being sold for pencils for this particular sales rep, and it's got a cost involved here. This information has been typed in here, but we're actually now going to do a calculation. The calculation that we learned earlier will be applied here, which is going to be multiplication. So the total will equal the number of units that are sold multiplied by the unit cost. By pushing enter, we get the same result as we had earlier. If we wanted to represent this as a dollar amount and actually have this formatting, you'll notice across the top here we've got a bunch of formatting options we can apply to the likes of numbers, one of which has this little dollar sign next to it. This is called accounting formatting. I don't particularly like this one because the dollar sign's so far away from our actual numbers. So what I prefer to use instead is actually the currency formatting. And you'll see some of these other options that you can see down here as well. By doing currency, however, you'll notice the dollar symbol is quite close. Other things that we sometimes want to adjust are the number of decimal points that go along with this. You can increase or decrease the number of decimal points to help show more or less levels of precision. One of the great things about Excel is that once you've done this calculation once, you can actually come down to the bottom right hand corner of this cell, left click when the mouse changes to the small plus symbol, and drag down. By doing that, it's smart enough to realize that every time this has dropped down here, we're no longer using these numbers, but the next row down. The same thing applies also to when we do calculations underneath columns. Fast way of being able to fill it all down is to simply double click on it and it will automatically fill down towards the bottom. So either of those methods will work. I can also overwrite some of the contents and it will simply reapply those formulas. It's also gone through and applied the formatting that I've selected, such as the likes of the number of decimal points. If I'd like to reapply that, simply double click and that new formatting has all come down. Let's go through now and show some additional calculations. So underneath the bottom here, we may choose to do some calculations. Some of the ones that we've learned already are the likes of our sum or total calculation. We might want to work out how many items are showing. We might want to know what the highest and lowest numbers within our range are going to be. We also might like to work out what the average of our values are going to be. Another useful thing that we often want to deal with in maths is the median. Medians and averages seem quite similar, but they do have quite different functions. So let's go through and start with the totals. Well, I've already shown this particular skill, and we can use the equals sum. Another thing that I'd like to show you, however, using the total or sum function, is this button up the top here. It's called auto sum, and this is basically a fast way of doing things that we've just already dealt with. So when I click on the auto sum button, it's recognizing the fact that we've got a bunch of numbers above it, and it's also selected the ranges of cells that contain those values. If there are some additional numbers in here that you don't want to include, you can simply recalculate or drag and show the cells that you'd like to be working with. Push the enter button to apply the formula. Again, if you'd like to simply drag that across, it's smart enough to know to mean that when we're doing the calculations, it's moved these columns across as well. The next one that I'm going to try and show you is something called the count formula. The count formula works out how many items are in this current selection. So if I was to push the enter button, it's going to show you that there are 19 entries in this list. Another quick way of finding out the same thing is to come down the bottom here after making a selection, and it will tell you that the average of those numbers in that range is this, the count is this, and the sum is this, which is actually matching up with these. That's just a quick way of being able to find things out. But if you'd like to permanently apply it, please don't use just type those numbers in. Always use a calculation or a formula to do that. Next thing I'm going to try and do is work out the highest number. We're going to use a function here called max, which stands for maximum. Highlight the cells that we'd like to work with in the brackets or parentheses, noticing the formula is also at the top here in the address bar. Push enter. There's our calculation being applied. Now, I've shown you how we can use auto sum, and you'll notice that we have a little drop down list. We can go through and apply these commonly used functions just at the simple click of a button. So the next one we're wanting to work on is the opposite of highest, and that's lowest, which is min or minimum. By clicking min, it's recognizing there's some numbers above it, but these are not the ranges of cells that we'd like to work with, so I'm going to reselect the cells that I'd like to include, push enter, and you can see that it's updated. Next one that we're going to deal with is called equals average. Average, what that does is it will sum up all of the numbers that you can see above, and it will divide it by the number of entries. So in this situation, it will be 941 divided by 19. But rather than doing those two separate calculations or steps, this function does all of the hard work for us. That's the same with the median function. To work out a median, of course, in maths, what you would normally have is all of your numbers in a ranked order, and it will pick out the middle number. Medians are often a better reflection of a midpoint than an average. The reason for that is because averages are often skewed by high or low numbers at the extreme boundaries. Now that I've got those calculations all worked out, rather than me doing them for each particular cell, or even dragging them across one at a time, I can actually select all of those, come across to the side, drag them across. Any formatting that I'd like to apply, I could simply highlight, select that we'd like to apply currency, and you'll notice here that it's all done. We may choose to have those as currency as well. Now, one of the things that we want to try and do here is to make our calculations stand out. One of the ways in which we might do that, as mentioned earlier, is to use the likes of some colours. we might choose to have some bolding occur. Other things that we might choose to use is the likes of borders. So using the borders toolbar, we can choose to turn borders on for all particular cells. Undoing that particular command, what I'm going to do here is apply a top and bottom border, which I think looks quite nice. So we've got a top line and a bottom line for this particular total. Using something called the Format Painter tool, I'm now going to click on that, and it's going to copy all of this formatting that I've applied here. And if I was to left click and drag, it's going to apply that formatting to the lines underneath. What that might look like if I was to try and show you after clearing my formatting using this particular option here. Sorry, Control Z undo. I'm going to clear the formats for this, is I'm going to say, look, I want to apply all of this formatting to all of the cells underneath. So I'm going to highlight, click on Format Painter, drag and say that I'd like to apply the formatting from the rows above to all of these ones under here. Noticing now that it's also applied the currency, background colors, borders, etc. to all of my labels. That pretty much shows most of the functions that we might need to look at covering for the likes of the standard in terms of sum, max, min, average, etc. count. Things that we often want to do now is to look at printing. You may notice that on this page here I've got these dotted lines. That represents the outside boundaries of an A4 printed page. Down towards the bottom here on row 49, that's the bottom that you can see. If I wanted to go and print using Control P as a shortcut key, I can bring up the print dialog box. At the moment it's showing that there are 3 pages that can be printed off. If I click on next, you'll notice that there is a blank page. On the 3rd page, however, I've got the shortcut keys that I showed earlier. So if I don't want to print all those pages because it would be a bit wasteful, I can say that I want to only print 1 to 1 page. By doing that, when I go to print things off, it's only going to be printing this particular worksheet off. It's going to try and print off all of my active worksheets. Another way of doing it is to make a selection by left clicking and saying this is the information that we'd like to be printing off. Rather than using Control P, we can also go File, Print. Going File, Print, I'm now going to change it to only print off the selection of cells. Notice that down the bottom when I do that, it will go from 1 of 3 to 1 of 1. So it's now only going to print off this one sheet. If I've got multiple pages within my workbook, I can also choose to print off every single page within my workbook. Other things that we may choose to do is we might want to try and put our name in a header, and we can do that in several ways. One way in which we can do that is by going to the Page Setup option. Going to Page Setup, you can change from Portrait to Landscape. You can adjust it or scale it to fit onto a single page, or you can make it fit onto a certain number of pages wide or tall. Under Margins, you can manually change how close it is from the top and the left of the pages, and the right also. You can also center things vertically and horizontally on a page as well. Going into Header Footer allows us to go through, click on Custom Header, and add in things like our name. It's better to do it in a header because this will apply to every single page in my document as opposed to one particular cell. You can do the same thing for a footer. Put the name of the course, or you can use some of these little built-in buttons to do things like inserting dates. On the Sheet tab, you can go through and tell it to print off all the grid lines. You'll notice in the print preview, even though we saw those little cells with lines on them, they won't actually print off unless we apply their borders. So if we'd like to see those grid lines, by clicking the grid lines option, it will actually have those turned on. Other things that we can do under the sheet is if we'd like to see those row and column headings, which might be helpful for the likes of calculations or for marking purposes for me, that's a way that you can actually show me how you can turn on the row and column headings. Alright, next thing that we're going to try and do here is just back out of this, and I'm going to show you how we can demonstrate that you've used correct formulas. So using our shortcuts from before, I'm going to bring those over a little bit now. I'm going to highlight a bunch of cells, right click, delete the columns so that everything's nice and close. Alright, Now that we've got all this information being nicely formatted and we're ready to try and complete some of the other tasks that are required for the assessment, we're going to look at selecting all of the data by pushing Control A, which selects just the internal information. If I push Control A again, it will make a selection of the entire worksheet. Another way of doing the same thing is to come to the top here, clicking this little button, and it will make a selection of everything. I'm going to push Control C to copy the data, click on this little plus button to insert a new sheet. If I was to simply come down here, double click on it, one of the things I can do is look at adding a formula page. I may choose to right click on it, rename, does the same thing. On this formula page, now that I've copied that information, I'm going to push Control V and it's going to paste the exact same information. Other things you can do if you want to copy it is to simply right click and you can make a copy, or Control and drag to make a copy as well. Using this formula page here, I'm now going to be pushing Control tilde to show all of the formulas. When I push Control tilde, you'll notice that you will see the formulas that we did earlier on. This date format has been a bit messed up, but we can just disregard that. One of the things that with a formula page we often need to do is to look at resizing columns so that it will fit everything effectively. So by simply highlighting all of my columns, double clicking here, it's going to automatically make the columns wide enough to fit all of the information that you can see, or in this case this whole average formula, which is the longest. Now that we've done that, if we go to try and print our work and we had stuff that was quite wide, by pushing Control P we sometimes need to look at altering the width of our pages. By doing this at the moment, you'll notice that with our formula page here, we've got a few things which don't quite fit. It's going on to 3 pages in total. So what we might need to do instead here is to change the orientation from portrait to landscape. We might also choose to change some of the margin settings down to being narrow. By doing that, sometimes we can make it all fit nicely onto a single page. In this case, it's just a bit too wide to fit onto one page. So using that option that I mentioned earlier called scaling, we've actually got a short way of doing it within this particular panel. We're going to try and fit all of the information onto a single sheet. You'll notice now that it's popping up. At the top here for my workbook, you'll notice that on page number 1 my name is appearing, but on the second page it is no longer there. So we'll need to go in there, select page setup, and apply the likes of headers and footers to each page. That's a lot of the skills that you're going to need to this point. When we start looking at some of the other skills that are needed, or just to recap, we've used add for some basic adding of numbers, subtracting, multiply, divide, sum, average, max, min, count, autofill. Autofill was that button here when we went to go through and drag things down like so. Formula checking. This allows you to review your formulas to make sure that we're using the correct cells. So for instance, in this example here, we could be reviewing our formulas by seeing that we've got the correct color coding. There are actually some other options that we've got in here with the likes of formula buttons. If I was to click away and have a look at see this cell, we can actually see which cells are being used to create this end answer. You can see that with the dot on these two cells here, that these are the cells that are used to create this. That's a little bit technical, so we're going to go through and remove the arrows and get rid of them. You can also do something called trace dependence. So what cells actually rely on this cell here? Well, in this situation, all of these functions down the bottom rely on this cell to be used. Again, I will click on the remove arrows option. Standard error detection and correction. So for this one here, when we do some calculations, we can get a little bit confused. If I push the escape button, an example of that would be is if I'm wanting to work out a percentage. So for instance, if I'm wanting to work out what is this $189 as a percentage of my total down the bottom. So to work out a percentage, we're going to be doing some division. So we want to know what is this number as a percentage, so we're going to use the divide symbol here, of this number down towards the bottom. So if I was to then push enter and apply that formula, you'll see a very small number appear. This is actually a percentage, it's a fractional number. So 0.02 is the same as 2%. Doesn't look like 2% because we need to apply some formatting. Under the Home tab, we can then say we'd like to do percentages. On a calculator, you'd actually do multiplying by 100, but using a spreadsheet, we don't need to do that final step. So just bear that in mind if you're ending up with very large numbers that don't seem to make a lot of sense. Rather than trying to actually multiply things by 100, we use the percentage symbol. The problem that we sometimes have is that when we want to try and do things quickly, we often want to try and fill things down, which may look like it appears to work, but then we end up with these errors further down. This area here refers to the fact that we're trying to have this cell divided by a different number. Okay, so G29. We learned earlier how the autofill little icon down the bottom can be really helpful to make things a lot faster. One of the issues, however, when we use that is that whenever this cell here is moving down, which we want, it's also coming down the bottom here, and this is also moving down here. So we're always wanting to be dividing by this total here and have this cell remain fixed. We don't want to be dividing by 19, by 1600, etc. And eventually it will pop out down the bottom. That's what this area here revolves around. It's trying to do G9, which is the cell that we'd like to be dividing by, or using. But then down towards the bottom, it's also dividing now by the contents of this cell, which is nothing. Which is why, like on a calculator, you get an error when you try and divide by 0. It's also saying the same thing here. We're getting divided by 0 error. So at the top here, what we need to try and do is use this concept called fixed cell address. The cell that we don't want to move is this G23, this cell down the very bottom. We want that cell to remain fixed. So in order to be able to do that, we need to put a dollar symbol before and after the letter. Okay, so what this does is it locks in column G so that it will never move from column G, and then it's also going to be locking in row 23. By applying that now and then filling the formula down like we did earlier, we won't have the same problem as we had before. It also will update and match the formatting from this previous cell. So that's how you can use fixed cell addressing to go through and get around that particular problem. Other problems that we sometimes come across is when we try and do some kind of math that doesn't make a lot of sense. So for instance, if we multiply this label by this value here, we're going to be getting an error such as value. Can't work that out. So those are probably the most common errors that you might come across. Other ones is when you have some kind of reference or reference error, and that's something that the calculation can't work through. We've also gone through now and worked on scaling. We've worked on active sheets. We know how to show formulas by pushing Control tilde. We know how to turn on grid lines. We know how to do headers and footers. We know how to also make a selection and only print that active selection. Review and comments, that's something which you may come across. When we do start looking to have errors like we had before, we'll often end up with this little green item. That green item is indicating there's an error. You can see this little exclamation point that pops up, and you can actually get some help on that error. Or you can actually see what is the problem with this error. Sometimes you'll actually see some kind of tip to try and help fix it, or in this case, if you click on help on this error, it may pop up some kind of little screen which gives you some guidance. Okay, so this is some of the built-in help which we might be able to use to try and solve this particular problem. I'm going to close that now. Other things that you can do is you can add comments to things so you can come back and review it later on. Under the review tab, you can add a comment. And you can see that that now has got a little red item or red triangle, which is indicating that a comment's been applied. When we go to save things, we should always give things descriptive names so we can find things easily on and put things into appropriate folders. Okay, so that's what logical structures refer to. So in your K drive or network folder, you should be giving things logical folder names and then saving things into the appropriate places. When you go to try and hand your assessment or tasks, using this teacher Dropbox, you will go through and copy and paste rather than save directly to that location because of read-write access issues. couple of things that I haven't covered just yet are the likes of some of these ones in here. We know how to move something, we know how to copy, we know how to insert, delete, undo, redo. Search and replace is something that we might want to try and look at. And formulas amended. We've known how to do naming worksheets. So the items we still need to cover are search and replace, formulas amended, the likes of some of our charts down the bottom as well. Okay, so let's go through, say, a formula amended. So over the side here, if we make a mistake of something that we'd like to alter, we would be amending our particular formula. So if we wanted to go through and do it by another cell instead, this is amending our formula. To go through and sort some of our data now, we might choose to be wanting to sort by the number of units and have the highest units towards the top and have these ranked. So there's a couple of ways in which we can do that. The most reliable method that I find is to make a selection of all of the information that you'd like to include in the sort. Notice that I've selected this top row which contains our labels. By doing that, when we go over to the sort and filter option, we can use custom sort. Under custom sort, you'll see that it's saying that my data has headers. Headers are these labels across the top here. When I go to the sort by column here, you'll notice that we've got those helpful labels across the top. If we didn't have that and have those turned off instead, it will simply say column A, column B, and you'd have to work that out yourself what you'd like to include. By saying my data has headers, it means that the information or the labels across the top will not be included in the sort. They're simply used to help denote the data underneath. So under here we're going to say that we'd like to have it sorted by units, and then we can choose to sort by smallest to largest, so have the smallest number at the top, largest at the bottom, or we may choose to have largest to smallest. You can also add additional levels if you'd like to sort on multiple items. So whereby you have two things on the same item, we may choose to sort it on a different thing, such as the unit price. Okay, so I'm now going to sort it on the largest to smallest for the units and the cost of smallest to largest. So in this situation, when we have two items that are the same, such as our 290s here, actually let's do something that's maybe a bit better. Let's maybe do it under just the smallest unit cost, then by unit cost. You might have noticed that those two there just changed slightly. So we've ranked it both on, first up on the units, and then if both of those are the same, I also wanted to have the item with the higher value being ranked towards the top. A good example of this would be names in a telephone book. All the names are in alphabetical order by the person's surname, but if we have matching names like Wang or Smith, then we'd use the first initial of their name to be sorting things. As I said before, we're wanting to go through and try and use find and select. Sometimes we might have a mistake. So for instance, for this East region, if we're wanting to try and reclassify all of those items, it might take a long time to go through all of these cells and to make that change. Using the find and select tool, however, we can go through and choose to find all instances or replace all instances of a particular item. So for instance, if I have all Easts and change it to Eastern, it will go through and I can manually review each one if I wanted to, or I may choose to replace them one at a time or replace all. Replace all, made 9 replacements, and that's a quick way of being able to do a find and replace. One of the last things that we need to be able to try and do here is to graph or chart our data. And it's really easy to be able to do that with the likes of a spreadsheet program. I'll show you a couple of ways in which we can do it. So coming across the top here, we're going to choose the cells that we'd like to include in our sort. So what I'd like to do here is to work out the items that we'd like to try and graph and their matching units that are sold. By selecting those two columns here, go up to the Insert tab, and you'll notice that we've got this whole section that relates to the likes of charts. We've got recommended charts to bring up this little dialog box, and you can see like a little visual representation of what that might look like. It's going to basically add some of those things up here, chart them together. You'll notice here, because we've got quite a lot of duplication, this one splits them out, whereas this one combines them. Okay, have a bit of a play with some of these charts because there's lots of different options in here. So some of the more common charts that we'll come across will be the likes of bar charts, will be the likes of um, column charts, and also the likes of pie charts. So those are probably the most common ones that we might like to use. You can also do 3D representations of those same charts. So once you're happy with one of those particular items, simply click it, click on OK, and here's our chart that pops up. You can go through, resize, drag the chart using these little handles, and we can also look at adding more or less information to this by clicking on the plus symbol. That will allow you to add things like chart titles, or axis titles I should say, to the bottom of our values. Okay, so just to provide some descriptive items. And over here, we're wanting to try and represent the fact that these are the units sold. Across the top here, we might want to have a more descriptive item. Good rule of thumb is that it should be a descriptive title which describes the chart. At the moment I've selected my chart, which you can see with these little handles. If I was to push Control P, this chart would print out in isolation. So if I was to hand this out to somebody, they should have enough of a descriptive title here to describe what's actually happening in below. If I was to click away from that particular chart so that it's no longer selected and go into the Control P option for printing, you'll notice now that both the chart and the data over here are being represented. So if you're a bit stuck, just make sure that you haven't accidentally clicked on the chart when you go to print things off. Other things that you can look at altering if you were to come in here is you can turn on more or less information. And some of them are actually not that helpful, such as maybe legends. Some of these items down the bottom here could also be removed. You can also go in there and resize the likes of the actual chart versus the matching bounding box. You can also go through and change styles and change colors, etc., and what's on there. Another quick way of doing that is going under the chart options that you can see all the chart tools. You can change the design of it by using the quick layout options. So if you're wanting to cycle through some of the commonly pre-built ones, this can be quite helpful. You may like everything on here apart from one particular item. You can simply click on it, click the delete key, and you notice that it resizes. When we're going to try and print things off, you need to be careful about space so that things are nice and clear. So for instance, because I've got quite a tall, thin set of data here, and also this chart, if I'm only wanting to go through and select and show this information, I could place it under the bottom here, push Control P, and then do a print selection. By doing that here, you'll notice that it prints nicely onto a single page because of the scaling options. That's one of our charts. Another way of charting is when you don't have cells that are directly next to each other. So for instance, if I'm wanting to chart off the region and these cells over here, for instance, the totals, if I push the Control button, that will allow me to go through and to chart cells that are not next to each other or not adjacent. Going up here, we're going to go through Insert, and in this case I'm going to do a pie chart. Okay, for this particular pie chart, I don't like the way that the labels are all over the side here. I might like to go into the quick layout option and have a bit of a play here and see if I can find a more preferred method. Across the top here, I may choose to add some additional things, or I could also choose to resize my chart, reposition things, make the whole thing a little bit smaller to make it fit maybe a bit nicer. You can also click on individual segments, move things out. So as you can see, we can make some pretty fast changes in a very short amount of time. Other things that you should be aware of with the likes of charts is that when we make a mistake and update the unit price here to say 400 or 300, look what happens in our chart. When I push the enter button, it's automatically going to update our chart. So it's almost interactive. Another couple of options that we might like to look at is this one here called wrapping. Sometimes what happens when you've got some quite large labels across the top here, they might not fit that nicely. So for instance, we might have a very long label, and it may not fit nicely inside of the contents of this cell because it's quite thin. Now I could make it very, very wide like so. However, that would be a bit of a waste of space in here. So one of the items that you can do is I may choose to flip or rotate and change the alignment of my labels. There's a little option in here which allows you to angle items in a different way. So for instance, by angling in such a way here, we may actually be able to save quite a bit of space. Or we may choose to rotate the text up like so. And that may be another way of being able to help us to fit things a little bit nicer. By doing that, I may also choose to try and alter some of the alignment options. That's what that particular item from the standard is talking about. Lastly, we've got a couple of things here for screen display options. So screen display options means that when we're wanting to review our data, we can sometimes get a little bit stuck. So down the bottom corner of our page here, we've got these little icons here. If you click on those, you'll notice that some of the grid lines disappearing, and that can be a little bit confusing sometimes. So if you're in a little bit of a space where you're a bit stuck, try these different options down the bottom. This one here is showing you where the edge of the page is. This one is just our normal view, and this one here is showing you the page layout. So where the margins are, the fact that you've got a header across the top and a footer down towards the bottom. So that's pretty much most of the skills that you're going to need for this standard. It's just a brief recap of some of the stuff that you've been working through in class, but hopefully it helps, and all the best.